Hello everybody, and thanks for tuning in today. My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group based in the southwest of Western Australia. For those of you that don't know us, we are a not-for-profit independent land care organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. And you can find out more about us and the work we do on our website, lowerblackwood.com.au. Today's webinar is supported by SoilWise. SoilWise is funded by the National Landcare Program Smart Farms Small Grants, an Australian government initiative. It's also supported by Healthy Estuaries WA, a state government program. The webinar forms part of our Regenerative Agriculture and Practice program, which is supported through the Shire of Augusta and Margaret River Environmental Management Fund. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge that our Lower Blackwood catchment and the work we do falls within Wadandi and Pilbamon Budja, within which our streams and tributaries flow to join the Great Gorblyup or Blackwood River. We recognise and respect that Wadandi and Pilbamon ancestors and their descendants are the traditional custodians of this country and have a long and continuing connection to this land. Just a few words on how the webinar will run today. You may have noticed that you can hear us but not speak yourself. That's deliberate, so we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely still ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your questions at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked either during or at the end of the presentation. Also, if you run into any technical difficulties, just let me know via the chat box and I'll see if I can fix it. Otherwise, don't worry if you have to leave early or drop out, as we are recording the session and I will email that session out to you next week. All right, so to the reason you've tuned in, I'm delighted to have us talking to us today, agroecologist Mark Tupman. For over 2 decades, Mark's been active in the fields of organic biodynamic production, permaculture, sustainability, agroecology, and holistic management. Through his business, Productive Ecology, Mark provides consultation, education, and training in the establishment of integrated living production systems. In addition to his consulting work, Mark also works as a project consultant to the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group on a range of soil health related projects and most recently has become a contributor to conversations in our online community, Talking After Hours. So Mark will be talking to us today on how the application of nutrients to the foliage of plants can be an effective way to improve crop or pasture nutritional status, and as a consequence, reduce the volume and costs of some inputs, whilst at the same time contribute to improved soil health. So without further ado, I would very much like to welcome Mark and hand over.
Thank you, Kate. Can you hear me all right? Yep, I think that's all good. Okay, hi folks. Today I'm going to focus very much on the practical aspects of how to put together a foliar nutrient program, how to apply foliar nutrition. I think, there's plenty of evidence that foliar nutrition has a place in nutrition programs and it can be a very effective way of getting nutrients into plants. However, there are lots of nuances to it, and I think most of the issues that people are having are with the practicalities. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on, and we're sort of putting it in a local context as well, talking about things that we can use and ingredients and things that we can get hold of here in Australia and in the southwest. So just a little bit briefly beforehand on why foliar nutrients. It does take a bit of effort to get a foliar application out, so there's got to be some good reasons to do it. One of the reasons is that often the soil delivery is not perfect of nutrients. There can be compromising conditions, dryness, there can be pH issues, there can be various things that happen in the soil that make nutrients somewhat unavailable and locked up. And so, putting the nutrients directly onto the leaves when soil delivery is compromised is one way of going about dealing with some of those issues. Foliar applied nutrients also, it's very efficient. So when you apply them, you only need lower quantities to get they go straight into the leaves, and they're very the uptake is very rapid. So you can put on an application and within 24 hours, a lot of those nutrients are already inside the plant. Whereas if you put something on the soil, it's going to take time to work its way through the profile, get into the roots and so on. It's also a very effective way of getting micronutrients into the plants. Sometimes you can't put large quantities of nutrients in via foliar because they can burn leaves, but micronutrients, you don't need large volumes at any one time. And micronutrients are notoriously poor uptake when we apply micronutrients to the soil, a lot of them, for a number of reasons. So we can put them on as a foliar is a very effective way. The other thing is we can get soluble nutrients into the plants without, at these low rates, without harming soil biology. Sometimes when we're putting soluble or salty nutrients onto the soil, it can, cause some issues in that department. And so enabling us to lower the rates and still get them into the plants and avoid harming that soil biology could be a reason to do it. And because we are using such low rates and the uptake is so efficient, you're avoiding problems like, leaching and runoff that can happen with soil applied nutrients as well. This is just to show you, this is, nutrient use efficiency in agricultural ecosystems around the world. Predominantly, they are put on the soil, and you can see that with certain nutrients, especially the trace elements, as I mentioned, the uptake from soil applied nutrients is pretty low. So, you're looking at areas like 2 to 5 or 1 to 2% of what you put on actually gets into the plant. And even things like phosphorus have quite a low uptake. Soil applied phosphorus for various reasons. They lock up in the soil and so on. So when we look at our trace elements, they are very important. When you, if you go across this chart and you look at something like iron or manganese, you'll see that they're very important for processes like photosynthesis, which, as we know, drives everything. It's the whole energy production system in the plant. And also things like protein synthesis as well. So when we're turning, we're trying to create all the important, compounds that a plant needs, all the amino acids and the enzymes and so on and so on. These are all protein or sort of molecules, I guess. And so we need to make sure that we're able to convert, our nitrogen sources into amino acids, peptides, proteins. And there's certain trace elements that are very important cofactors for that. They're also really important for reproductive support when plants are pollinating and flowering, and of course fruit fill and quality as well. You can see there's big chunks there next to zinc, boron, copper, manganese. So yeah, the trace elements are really important and often overlooked in our systems, and applying them to the soil can be problematic. And we've got a lot of leverage if we can apply some of these things with the foliar instead of putting it on the soil. It gives us a lot of leverage to improve our production quality. This is just a quick glimpse at the salt index of common fertilizers, and these kind of things, when we put them on the soil in the amounts needed to get them into the plant, they can burn the biology. So again, it's just reiterating that we can get these soluble nutrients into the plants at low rates through a foliar instead of having to put larger rates on the soil. It's not all. There are some limitations with foliar applied nutrition, as otherwise we'd all be doing it all the time. Plants still get most of their nutrients from the soil, and especially the macronutrients, the quantities that you need, most of them are going to come from the soil. So while the trace elements might be, easy to get the quantities we need into the plants via foliar, you're going to have a good supply of macronutrients from the soil as well. Because you can only put low rates on, and they are very efficient, but it does mean you're going to have to apply them more regularly, top them up, because the application you put on a couple of weeks ago, the plants grow a bit bigger, they might need a bit more. And if they're not getting that delivery from the soil, then you are going to need to do regular applications. And that can sometimes involve, you've got to drive out into the paddocks. There's logistical problems with that. It takes time. You've got to have the equipment to get them out. You've got to be careful not to too much traffic and compaction. So you need to have good access ways and so on. And also remembering that there are certain nutrients, even some of the trace nutrients, that are needed in the soil for various functions, either the soil biology or the roots of the plants. So yeah, they're not going to be everything in the program, a foliar program, but definitely it can form part of your overall nutrition program. Getting into making up some foliar sprays, because it's a liquid product and you're getting it out, you're spraying it out through nozzles, and you want the plant uptake to be good, generally you're looking at soluble fertilizers or tech grade fertilizers. So we're using those kind of those forms of fertilizers to make uptake mixes. You can't always use even some of the soluble fertilizers that come in a granular form, might have other ingredients in and so on. So we want to look towards using fertilizer products that are designed to be used in a liquid and fully soluble. Some people are using micronized minerals in foliar sprays, but they do settle out a little bit, and depending on how micronized they are and so on, they can be a little bit problematic, and they don't have the uptake that the soluble fertilizers have. So there's a bit of more work to be done in this field, but as a general rule of thumb, the soluble fertilizers are way more reliable, and they're generally what people are using in their programs. So when we talk about solubility, there's various forms that fertilizer comes in, and you'll find that some of these things apply to the soil environment as well. When you've got things like oxides and hydroxides in your soil, they are insoluble, and sometimes if those things form in your spray tank, they're going to cause problems as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But generally, all of the ammonium, nitrate, potassium, sodium, and chloride salts are soluble, and all the sulfates that you buy, manganese sulfate, magnesium sulfate, zinc sulfate, etc., are all soluble except for calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. Probably most of you are not going to learn those rules off by heart. There's just a sack of soluble. You can see it's got fertilizer for use in fertigation, so a soluble fertilizer there, magnesium sulfate. But we've kind of made it easy for you. So these are sort of some forms of fertilizer that you can use, and you can see their analysis as well. So it gives you an idea of how much of the actual nutrient you're getting when you apply that fertilizer. And another important factor is the solubility of it. So you see how much of it you can put into a tank mix before it starts to reach saturation point, and you can't dissolve any more in there. Most of the time there's no trouble with tank mixes unless you're putting out very low rates. But sometimes when you're making up these formulations before you put them in the spray tank, you might not be able to dissolve all of them in low quantities of water. So certain fertilizers, like say potassium sulfate, for instance, is a lot less soluble, only 11 kilos per 100 liters, whereas something like urea, you can actually do like 105 kilos per 100 liters. So another one that's notoriously quite hard to dissolve is Solubor. You can only get so much Solubor into a volume of water. So that's a boron fertilizer. Then there's compatibility. So as we were sort of talking about before, some things are not so soluble, some sort of molecule forms, and we saw that, say that the carbonates and the bicarbonates and the oxides and all that are not so soluble. And we talked about how all sulfates are soluble except for calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. These rules, again, I'm not going to go into them in a big way now, but notoriously, calcium, for instance, is notoriously problematic mixing in spray tanks because it forms these things like calcium sulfate with all the sulfates you might mix them with. So if you put, for instance, calcium nitrate with zinc sulfate, it would form gypsum and settle out in your tank. And phosphorus fertilizers can be problematic as well because you end up forming zinc phosphates and calcium phosphates and all these sort of things too. Things like urea are pretty widely compatible. Ammonium nitrate, potassium nitrate, some of these things that, were listed before are really quite compatible. Again, with a lot of things. Again, we sort of want to make it easier for you. So these charts, this document from Incitec Pivot Fertilizers on foliar nutrition is great. It's got lots of information in it. And there's a sort of chart. So, you can pick a column. If you went to, say, calcium nitrate and you scanned across that, you can see there's quite a lot of crosses in that row, just because there's a lot of things that calcium is not compatible with. Whereas if you look at something like urea, there's ticks across the whole row. Some of your trace minerals like your metallic sulfates are compatible with some things, but not others. But then when you chelate them, they become much more widely compatible. So that's kind of a chart you'd refer to. If you're doing up a tank mix and you were mixing a bunch of fertilizers together, you want to make sure that they're going to be compatible, because otherwise you're going to run into problems. They're going to settle out. They're not going to get into the plants, and so on. Application rates, obviously pretty important. You can only put so much in a foliar spray, because otherwise it could burn your foliage. So a chart like this, again, we're not going to go through much of it, but you can refer to these sort of documents, and it will just give you an idea of how much you can put out at any one time. So if we just look at just a couple of examples, so iron sulfate, you're looking at something like 1 kilo per hectare, quite low rates. When you're looking at something like molybdenum, sodium molybdate, it's really quite a low amount, 50 grams per hectare. But we look at some more of the macro fertilizers on the next sheet, and you might be used to be putting out more than 10 kilos a hectare of urea, and probably more than 5 kilos a hectare of MAP in a general sort of fertilizer application. But as a foliar rate, that's pretty much right on. So again, just and then obviously depending on what sort of enterprise you are, how much water you're going to need in the tank to distribute it across the field or in the crop and so on. So you might find that sort of in trees and vines, you might use 1,000 litres a hectare to get all the trees thoroughly watered or the foliage covered, whereas in a field crop or something, a grain situation, you might be using as little as like 100 litres a hectare, or even down to 50 litres a hectare. Obviously, the lower amount of water you use in the tank to get a foliar out, the more you've got to be aware of the concentration of the tank and make sure that it's not too high and you're not going to burn things. But we'll get into that in a bit. So we want what we apply to the foliage to be taken up as efficiently as possible. And there's a number of things that we can add to the fertilizers to improve the uptake and improve the status or the form of the fertilizer, so that the plants can actually utilize it better. So here's just a bit of a list. So what happens, what we can do when we're adding some of these organic acids and things like that to a mineral is we can wrap them up in a more organic molecule, and that can improve the stability of things, so it can keep that molecule in a plant available state. It can also because the molecule, say if you've got a metallic sulfate, say you've got manganese 2+, because it's got a charge, it can sometimes get stuck on the leaf, attached to things. Whereas if it's in an organic molecule, it's chelated like this, then it hasn't got a charge and it can flow more easily into the leaf and into the plant. Also, when you're putting these, when you're wrapping up your nutrition with organic molecules, often there's an energy bonus that comes with it. There's some carbon in there, so the plants don't have to spend as much energy themselves making the nutrients we apply into the molecules that they need. So there's a number of reasons that we'd want to wrap things up in an organic molecule. These kind of organic molecules are what occurs naturally in soils all the time, which are full of organic acids and so on. There's a number of things that you can use to do this, improve the uptake of your nutrients and improve the form that they're in. Some of the common ingredients that we use are fulvic acid, citric acid, amino acids, fish hydrolysate, seaweed molasses, and then even something like a bioferment is an organic acid of form of sorts. And then, there's some of the other things like vermicast and compost teas. They also have organic acids in them, and so on. Potassium silicate's an alkaline substance. It's a bit different, but nonetheless, it's a biostimulant, so it can be used in a foliar spray. Not very widely compatible, though. So yeah, all of these organic acids, they have, they're organic molecules. They really help, with the uptake, and they chelate and complex the nutrients so that they're in a form that is more user-friendly, I guess, for a plant, without getting too technical. again, we want to make it easy for you. So I'm just going to give you some examples of recipes and how we do this. So this is a trace element mix, and we've got, this is a general purpose sort of all the trace elements in the mix sort of recipe. And then what we're doing is we're going to mix that with some fulvic acid and some citric acid to lower the pH, to chelate and complex the nutrients, and just improve the uptake of it and the stability of the whole mix. It also helps with storage, dropping the pH like that. And yeah, there's that sort of, in a way, is going to, we're combining a number of things that sort of the sum of the parts becomes greater than the individual parts. There is a number of things we could add to this trace mix as well. We can add some of the macro fertilizers at slightly higher rates, like urea and potassium sulfate or MAP. And again, there's some more biostimulants that we could add, or microbe foods, or whatever you want to call them, as well, like molasses, seaweed, fish, etc. So yeah, that's sort of like a general purpose mix. And I put the trace element mix up there first because, again, this is something that's, trace elements through foliar application is a very effective way of getting them into the plants. And because we're putting such low rates out, we're not going to really cause any problems in terms of the balance, the soil balance, and so on. So we can quite safely put these sort of trace element applications out, provided, we're not putting them out too often. When it comes to putting out nitrogen, there is just a couple of considerations. Again, when we talked about, if we're trying to get the plants to, make proteins and so on, there's a number of sort of cofactors or other minerals that are good to put out with nitrogen. It's also quite an energy intensive process for plants to produce proteins and amino acids out of, nitrate or ammonium. And so we can do things like add some carbohydrates to the tank, like some molasses. And we can also add some of these cofactor minerals like sulfur and molybdenum, which are part of the nitrate reductase enzyme. They help convert nitrate into amino acids and so on. And then, something like nickel, which is part of the urease enzyme, which helps plants to be able to utilize urea when we apply it. So it's just adding a little bit of these sort of things into the tank to make sure that our nitrogen conversion is efficient. And, some of these are also part of the actual protein molecule as well. So sulfur, for instance, is quite a good thing to add to the tank with nitrogen. And this goes for soil applications as well as foliar applications. There's just a little picture of the urease enzyme, and you can see it's got the nickel in there. So there's an example of a liquid nitrogen mix. And you can see, again, some of the usual culprits. We've got some fulvic acid in it. We've got our urea, which is, the nitrogen source. And then we've also added a sulfur source. So like whether it's ammonium sulfate or sulfate of potash or magnesium sulfate, we've put some molybdenum in there. Again, all of this is going to help with that conversion process, and a little bit of nickel as well. And then there are some extras that are also compatible that we can add to the tank if we want to. And then there's the application rates there as well. Just a final recipe. Some of the ingredients that you might buy or want to put out are alkaline soluble. So these are you're best actually keeping the tank mix alkaline. So for instance, potassium humate, for instance, if we drop the pH too much, it's going to settle out. So what I've just done here is just listed a bunch of alkaline sort of compatible ingredients that you could mix with something like potassium silicate, which is not widely compatible with many things. However, it is compatible with soluble seaweed powder, soluble sodium molybdate, and some of those other things like micronized minerals and so on. So yeah, if you are putting out a spray of something like potassium silicate, you do have to be aware of that. There, even in Margaret River, for instance, people are putting out sulfur sprays, which are quite alkaline in their nature. And I've noticed that when you mix things like fish, which is an acidic input, with them, you can have some problems. So it's just being aware of what ingredients you're using and making sure that you're not putting anything in there that's going to cause problems. if you're not 100% sure, one thing that you can do as well as a jar test, which involves just making up a tank mix, a small batch of it, not actually putting it in the tank, and putting it in a jar and just seeing what happens, seeing if it reacts and seeing if things settle out. Sometimes some things naturally settle out anyway. So I recommend if you are doing a jar test, you get one ingredient in one jar, one ingredient in another jar, and then a jar with the combination of the both. So you've got a reference point and you can look at the ingredient by itself and just make sure that the settling out is not just what naturally happens with that ingredient. Sometimes the settling out is not an issue. It just needs a bit of agitation and then it's back in suspension and you can still use it. But yeah, jar test is not a bad idea if you're not sure. Because we're applying foliar nutrients to the plants, to the leaves, to the above ground part of the plant, plant leaf testing makes sense. It's very complementary for a foliar nutrition program. So whether you're doing leaf tissue testing or plant sap analysis, that would be a very good way of determining the status of your plant nutrition, I suppose. And often these sort of tests will pinpoint something that maybe is deficient in a leaf, for instance, and that might be affecting your photosynthesis or your protein synthesis or something else. And you can pretty much diagnose it fairly quickly and then apply a foliar application and address it immediately. And that's a very quick way of dealing with problems that can cost us in the season. If we can get our photosynthesis up really quickly with a foliar spray, then it's a very effective way of going about our nutrition. This is just an example of a tissue test, and again it's just showing some ingredients that are in the optimal range, some that are low. As you can see, again, quite a few of the traces are low. Potassium is particularly low in this case. So if we had done if we'd received these sort of results, we might make up a foliar spray with some of those trace elements that are low, and we might add a bit of potassium sulfate in there as well, maybe a bit of MAP, and we would probably mix it all with some citric or fulvic acid and any of those other biostimulants that we might want to add into the mix. This is a sap test. This differential type sap testing is testing the old and the young leaves, and that can be an important thing too, because sometimes we have mobile nutrients in the plants, and what's low on an older leaf might, or what's not low on a young leaf might be low on an older leaf because the plants are partitioning or prioritizing younger growth. So yeah, there's definitely scope for looking at testing both old and young leaves with certain nutrients like nitrogen and potassium, for instance. If you look at this particular result, the young leaves potassium is in the optimum range. That's the light green. And if you look at the dark green, it's actually quite low in the older leaves. So the plants are taking potassium out of the older leaves, putting it into the younger leaves. And if you just tested the younger leaves in this case, you might think your potassium levels are okay, but they're actually not. They're low, and you could actually be improving the growth in across the board in your older leaves and your younger leaves by adding some potassium in that situation. Again, you can see some of these trace elements are pretty low, and this is quite standard. We're seeing it all the time with a lot of the plant testing. And again, this is where there's lots of scope to use a foliar application of trace elements. In this case, you might add a bit of sulfate of potash again to it. It looks like phosphorus is a bit low as well. Silica is a bit hard to get in with a foliar spray, but maybe you would look at a separate application for that one. Potassium silicate's not widely compatible with the other ingredients anyway. Just a little page there just showing what the nutrient mobility is like. Different nutrients are more mobile, and so when we talk about the older leaves, sometimes the deficiencies first appearing there, some of those things, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium is where you'll often see those deficiencies, whereas some of the less plant mobile nutrients might show up more in the younger leaves or across the board. They're a bit slower to get to the new growth sometimes. For those that like the diagrammatic version, there there it is again. You can see those less mobile nutrients, the more mobile nutrients like potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, and magnesium are showing up on the lower leaves of the plant, the older leaves. So the plants are petitioning those nutrients and prioritizing young growth. There are also tools that you can use in the field. It's quite hard to work with these tools in terms of absolute values and reference levels for nutrients, but they can be useful tools just to test the effectiveness of like foliar sprays. So for instance, a refractometer using to measure the Brix, so that's the dissolved solids in the plant sap. Now, if you apply a foliar spray and it's very effective and your photosynthesis goes up, your Brix is going to go up too. So you could do a side-by-side comparison. You have one area where you apply a foliar spray and another area where you don't, and you test it 24 hours later, and you side-by-side test them. And if you've got a jump in your Brix, then you know that there's something in the foliar spray that's being effective. The other meters like these Hariba little handheld meters, again, reference levels are not so useful or reliable. But something like a potassium meter, because it's a mobile nutrient, you could test the old leaf and the younger leaf. And if there's higher levels in the younger leaf, you might, it's pointing to the fact that the plants are taking some nutrients from the older leaves because they need more in the younger leaves, and you've got a slight deficiency. Or the opposite might be the case too, where you've got sort of higher levels in the older leaves and the plants are actually stockpiling the excess supply that they've got, in which case you don't need to add more. These meters can also be useful when you're designing your spray mixes because there's a pH meter that you can use, so you can check the pH of your spray mix, and also electrical conductivity. There's an electrical conductivity meter that you can use to test how the dissolved ions in your mix, if it's too concentrated or not. But we'll talk about that in a second. So water quality is a huge factor. For those of us that have been playing around with foliar sprays for a while, we spent a lot of time on getting tank formulations right, using chelating agents, getting the pHs right, using the right sort of biostimulants with them. And all of that was to no avail if the water quality is not good. So there's a number of reasons why you might have trouble because your water quality is not good. The first one is that it just, as we were talking about the EC, if the water's too salty, it can actually cause problems like burning and just high sodium levels in your leaves and so on. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're doing regular foliar applications, it's best to keep your EC below 3,800 parts per million. So you can just test your tank mix with, again, a little meter like an EC meter and just see where it's at. If you're following the recipes and the rates that are on those Incitec pivot charts that I provided earlier, where they're talking about how much rates you'd put out per hectare, then there's a good chance that you're going to be well within the realm of where you need to be in terms of the nutrients you're adding to the tank. But it might also be worth testing your water just to see what the EC is like naturally. It's always a good idea to just get an idea of where your water's at, testing the conductivity, the pH, the hardness, etc. The pH is very, very much an important factor. Most of our nutrients will get into the leaves much better with a slightly acidic spray, sort of between 5 and 6.5. When you think of rainwater, it's on the acidic side between 5 and 5.5, and that's actually a really good range to aim for in terms of the pH of your tank mix. If it's extremely acidic or extremely alkaline, it can harm the foliage. But hard water, when we're using groundwater and there's from bores or dams or so on, and if there is a higher levels of carbonates or bicarbonates, etc. in there, then they are very reactive and they will react with the nutrients that you put in the spray tank, and they will settle out and precipitate and become unavailable, but also could potentially sort of block up your nozzles and so on as well. So any water that's got a hardness above 70 parts per million is starting to compromise the effectiveness of your spray, and it also could be causing settle out problems. And once you start to get up above 150 parts per million, you're really you're really reducing the effectiveness of your nutrient applications quite significantly with a lot of the nutrients that you apply. Remembering also that some fertilizers will change the pH. So MAP, for instance, is commonly used to acidify the mix a bit, but you can also adjust the pH with acidifying agents like citric acid, fulvic acid, etc., or alkalizing agents. If you have a very acidic mix and you want to bring it up a bit, you could use something like sodium carbonate. Yeah, again, the issues that we've all had have been having for a long time is that our water was a lot of the water that around here and in a lot of parts of Australia is a little bit hard, and the pH might not be low enough, can be sometimes towards the alkaline side, and then you put out a foliar spray and you just don't get the results that you want. Once we started using agents like citric acid, you can sort of temporarily pacify the bicarbonates and the carbonates, and provided you get the spray out fairly quickly after you've acidified it, then your uptake can be a lot better. Short of that, using rainwater or reverse osmosis water, if you have such a facility, would be an ideal way to go. Rainwater is great to use, but yeah, if you're using dam or bore water, you want to get it tested, and you maybe want to look at using agents to acidify it just before you apply it. In the recipes that I provided earlier, we automatically put a significant amount of citric acid and fulvic acid and so on into the mixes, and that naturally is going to bring your tank mix down to a lower pH range, and it's going to make the uptake much more effective. However, you wouldn't want to leave that overnight because it'll gradually neutralize and not be as effective anymore. So when we get into the tank mixing order, the first thing you want to put into your tank is the water itself. It's going to help dilute everything. So, you're not putting in too much concentrated stuff together. Anything that goes into the mix once you've added the water first is going to be more diluted. So you can then put your pesticides and so on in, your herbicides maybe, probably less using herbicides with the foliar spray of nutrition, but pesticides maybe, and that will dilute the mix. And then you're going to get less reaction problems. You can add your fertilizers into this. This is not a hard and fast mixing order, but generally, yes, getting the water in first, then adding some of the ingredients, the pesticides, the fertilizers, maybe your biostimulants. It is, however, important that if you're adding inoculants or biology into your tank mix, that you do that at the end, because you really don't want to be putting neat pesticides, for instance, or fertilizers in a concentrated form into the tank when there's already biology in there, because that concentrated area of the tank, when you first put it in, will kill biology. And yeah, so obviously you want to put biology into the tank when it's everything else that's going into it is already well and truly diluted, and then it stands a better chance of surviving when you get it out there. Surfactants also really important. They help, with your nutrients being able to sort of like stick to the leaves, spread over the leaf surface, not bleed so much, and just generally enable them to get into across the leaves and spread and hold onto the leaves and get into the leaves much better. Even some of the biostimulants that we listed before are great sort of stickers or surfactants, or so things like fish hydrolysate, for instance, got lots of oils in it, so it can be a good sticker. Some of the soapier ingredients also are surfactant as well, so some plant extracts and things like that. But generally, these surfactant spreader stickers will have a bit of a fat form, an oil or a lipid form in there, and a soapy form as well. And that just helps your mix spread over the leaf and stick to it and get into it. Another thing that some people sometimes do is add a little bit of sort of an ingredient with a high point of deliquescence. So if you understand how salt will sort of, I guess, take in moisture from the air, and it just keeps the mix moist on the leaves for longer. So, there's certain ingredients like potassium nitrate, for instance, which has a high point of deliquescence, or you might use something like concentrated sea minerals, and just adding a little bit of those into your mix can help your mix stay moist on the leaf for a bit longer. Once it dries out, obviously, it's a lot harder for it to get into the plant. There's a bit of a jar test. Once you've got your your tank mix sort of down, or you want to try a tank mix before you put it out, if you're not sure, again, like I said, in this case, I would have one ingredient on the left, another ingredient on the right, and then in the middle jar, I've got a combination of the two. And you can see that the ingredient on the left, there is some settling out down the bottom naturally. So it might have been a micronized mineral, for instance, and I want to know that that is not the result of a reaction with the other thing. So this is why sometimes it's good to mix your things together, but also have the individual components in the jar as well, just so you can make sure that the settling out is a product of a reaction, not just the initial ingredient. When we apply our foliar sprays, the stomati of the uptake is just a lot better when in the milder conditions, and the nutrients can get into the leaves in a number of ways, but one of the major pathways is through the leaf stomatae, which can be on the underside and the top of the leaves. In dicots, predominantly on the underside, and the stomati, as conditions warm up and so on through the day, they tend to close. And so, the uptake will be compromised. We also want to apply foliar spray, when it's dry. Obviously, if there's rain around or too much moisture, then it's going to dilute application, and we're not going to get as much into the plants. And of course, when you're dealing with sprays, foliar sprays, there's going to be, if it's very windy, it's going to cause drift. It's going to be hard to target your plants and so on. So really looking at mild conditions early in the morning or later in the afternoon if you can. And dry conditions. You kind of want to make sure that you do hit the underside of the leaves, especially in dicots, because that's where most of the stomates are. So you're looking at a spray rig that has good coverage, and you can get spray onto the leaves quite uniformly, and you don't want it to be just hitting certain parts, getting too concentrated and dripping off, but not hitting other parts of the plants. So it's just a matter of matching your equipment to your crop or your situation so that you've got good coverage. And yeah, we obviously need to apply foliar sprays more regularly than we would soil applications, because you're putting out such low rates, and if nutrients are not so plant mobile, what will happen is that you'll get new growth come on after you've put out a foliar spray that doesn't get a hit of it, and because the nutrients are not mobile in the plant, they can't move to the new leaves, so you have to keep topping up that new growth from time to time with a spray. Sometimes the foliar spray can work in a way where it's improving your overall plant function and it's improving your root exudation, in which case the biology in the soil gets more active, and you'll find that often when you first apply a foliar spray, it won't maintain its levels for quite as long, but as you keep on applying them through the season, the whole status of the soil and the plant and the delivery system gets better and improves, and you find that the levels don't drop off so much after a spray as they might have initially, and start to maintain a lot better. And obviously you can then adjust your program. There are obviously also points of the season that are more pertinent than others. When you're first getting plants going early in the season and that new growth, you really want to make sure it's got everything it needs to set it up for the rest of the season. And then there also might be times of year where at certain stages of growth it needs certain nutrients. Say fruit fill would be a classic example where it might need more potassium, and so you might look at putting some of that, a bit extra of that in your spray. There'll be times where they need a bit more nitrogen maybe, but again, best done in conjunction with a good plant testing program so you can see what's going on. And I highly recommend, if you are doing foliar sprays and you're doing a plant testing program, that you do it over a whole season, because you start to get a feel for the trends, when you're going to be deficient in certain nutrients, when you're going to need more of them. And so you can sort of start to design or plan your foliar sprays in advance, and just make sure that your plants get everything they need at each part of the season. And I think that is about it, folks. So I can bring you back on, Kate, and let's see if there's any questions after all that.
Mark?
No problem.
Hopefully we won't have any sound issues. Mark is actually in the same place as me, just a different room. So we're hoping there's not going to be any feedback. It doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat box yet, but I have a couple while people are thinking. Just going back to your slide on tank mixing order, I might have missed it, but at what point do you put in the citric acid if you wanted to do it? Do you put it at the end, or do you put it before you've even started?
You want to put your citric acid in before you put your fertilizers in, if you've got carbonates, bicarbonates, hard water, etc., high pH, because you want to get that water into a state that it's not going to react with your nutrients. You might also want to put your citric acid in before you put your pesticides in, depending on what the optimal pH for your pesticide is as well. And that's why we kind of tend to mix the citric acid with the nutrients, just to guarantee that when people put the nutrients into the tank, it's already there. That said, once you've actually got everything in, you'll find all the different ingredients have changed the pH of the tank mix. And so it's always worth kind of checking it at the end, the whole tank mix. And this is, again, where doing it in advance is a good idea rather than sort of, having a whole tank that's not ideal. Just testing things and getting a feel for your water and how much it's going to take to adjust the pH and how the fertilizers, etc., are going to affect it. But you have quite a wide range. You can get down quite low for the uptake of certain things like zinc, for instance, or iron is better in a low pH, whereas some of the other things better, not so acidic. But you've got sort of an area between about 4 and sort of 6.5, 7 as an area where you can have your pH, and it's sort of okay. However, if you have got high bicarbonates and stuff, I would definitely be erring on the side of a more acidic mix just to sort that out, to neutralize it.
And the test, how you test the pH, I know you've got a pH meter.
Yeah.
Which is basically just put a drop of the water or the liquid on and it'll show. Are there any other tools that people can use to test for pH effectively?
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of meters, and then the cheap way is just the test strips. You can buy those test strips; they're really quite cheap. They might not be quite as accurate, and you certainly got to be able to sort of interpret the color of it. But they'll give you an idea where you are. Hopefully get you into the ballpark. I think once you've done a foliar program for a while, you start to get a pretty good feel of your water source and how it's working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also, there's still no questions because you must have answered it for everybody.
That's always the kind thing you say, Kate. I might have just bamboozled everybody.
When you said about application and you said regular,
yep.
Is there a kind of rule of thumb? Is it every fortnight, or do you?
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's kind of the same with soil applications and fertigation applications. The more regular and the less sort of concentrated your applications are, the more uniform your nutrition is, at all times. So all the better. However, practically getting out on the field that much is quite challenging for people. We tend to, depending on your testing program as well. So if you're testing once a month, you might just adjust your spray based on your monthly result and just put out one spray and then test it again, then spray again. Ideally, you want to get a couple of good applications in early in the season if you can, maybe a fortnight apart or a month apart. So it's a bit of a hard question to answer with an exact sort of length of time, and it's going to be different for different crops and depending on the severity of your nutrient deficiency. But sort of in conjunction with what's going to work for you and your program and your testing program as well.
We do have a question from Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. Mark, with the ability of phosphorus to be bound up in soils, do you think more regular foliar applications would make more sense?
I think that it's a case of incorporating, phosphorus is a macronutrient, so you do need a decent amount of it to come from the soil as well. And normally with things like this, you need to approach them from a number of angles. And I think you definitely need to work on a phosphorus supply from the soils, but foliar phosphorus is a great supplement and a really good way of just, keeping a source of phosphorus going out through the season. Whenever you put out a foliar application, if you can put phosphorus in the mix, if it's compatible, then and you've got problems with it, then you would add it into the mix. So phosphorus as a foliar program alone is probably not going to be sufficient, but definitely a good complement to your soil program.
Would you say that same with nitrogen, Mark?
Yeah, definitely. Yep. Again, nitrogen and phosphorus, they're both macronutrients. You couldn't possibly get all you need in there with a foliar program through the season, but you can certainly, you know, like nitrogen, for instance, when the weather's cold and the biological activity is a bit compromised in the soil, that, you know, there's less nitrogen fixation or delivery, then that might be a good time to add some, you know, foliar urea into the mix and help you get through those times when the soil delivery is compromised. But again, most of your nitrogen is going to come from your soil.
Yeah, and I should have said, and what about potassium? You know, the big three NPKs.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, same. Yeah, great. And sorry, a segue on from what we were talking about before about regularity of foliar spraying.
Yep.
Would you say it's pretty quick for people to understand what the signs of deficiency look like on their plants so that they can make decisions accordingly?
Yes. Well, no, actually. By the time you've got a visual deficiency showing on your plants, it's normally you've already lost out to quite a large degree. So you've already sort of, you know, compromised your production. And that's where, you know, sure, I mean, if you see a deficiency and you can identify it, and, you know, you might be pretty good at identifying the deficiencies on your particular crop, then you would want to address it as quickly as possible. But ideally, you want to nip those things in the bud before they get so extreme that they're showing visually on the plant. So yeah, I mean, whether it's with testing or whether you just got a maintenance program, you know, like with the trace elements, for instance, we just matter of course these days we'll often put out foliar sprays before we even test, just low rates, just to make sure we've got a bit in there. And, you know, the amounts that you're putting out, even of nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff, it's really not enough to upset the apple cart. So you can quite safely put these low rates out in a foliar, and then, you know, without breaking the bank, if you're going to be putting out a spray anyway, and then, you know, hopefully you do some testing. But yeah, by the time it appears on the plant, it is quite late into the picture.
Yeah, and so that does sort of speak to the age of the plant when you're putting foliars on as well, doesn't it? Because, say, in a pasture scenario, the quantity of biomass you've got to cover is quite substantial. So
yeah, that's a great point, Kate. I mean, you've got more foliage to cover, so you need higher rates as the plants get bigger. Also, as the leaves sort of get older, they, like all of us, they kind of harden off a little bit, and they might, you know, the uptake might not be quite as good. And, you know, like there's compounding effects too. So if you can get your nutrition right early in the season, it ultimately ends up, you know, paying you back in terms of the plants are photosynthesizing very efficiently and they're putting more out to the soil, and then the whole microbiome in the soil is more active, and then that then feeds back into the plants and better photosynthesis, and it compounds. So I think, you know, again, it's really important to get your nutrition right early in the season. And it can also, you know, foliar can be very handy for some, you know, say for instance, red-legged earth mites, where you might have a problem where you've got plants with high nitrates, or they're not converting into proteins properly because of just a few missing cofactors. And you can get a foliar spray out, and within 48 hours, you can sort out your red-legged earth mite problem straight away, you know, if you can get it right. So, you know, it's just such an effective way of sorting out those problems early, which are going to really flow on in terms of your profitability and so on.
yeah, so I mean, when you say early, you can start as early as, I mean, obviously not in a perennial crop like the vines or whatever, because they're already planted, but in a pasture scenario, for example, you can start by the seed, putting it on the seed. Well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a foliar then, I suppose, but yeah, you can definitely look at ways of putting your traces out. It is, however, quite hard, like with all the nutrients, to put enough around the seed to give it what it needs without, you know, you've just got to be careful not to put too much around the seed because it can cause issues as well. And that's one of the beauties of a foliar, is that, you know, you're putting out such low rates, but the uptake's so good that you're not going to cause those problems. The other thing is obviously the seed will have, you know, should have some nutrition in it as well. So ideally with the foliars, you're sort of waiting until you've just got enough foliage out of the ground to be able to get uptake through the leaves. So you wouldn't be going out straight away, but yeah, as soon as you've got enough leaf matter to cover and get it out there, then that's a good time to hit it up.
Yep. Well, it doesn't look like anyone else has got any questions. Amazingly.
Yeah, maybe just one last thing I could say, Kate, because I mean, there's a lot of information shared there. And, you know, I take for granted that I've been doing foliar sprays for a long time. But as a default, you know, like go to those recipes. If you want to try something, go to the recipes. They're very easy to make. You know, it's really just, you've seen us make them before. It's just getting a container and water and mixing those ingredients in there, applying them at the rates. And we've done the work for you in a sense there. And yeah, I just, by all means, get familiar with all the rules of compatibility and concentrations and everything. But yeah, we have done a lot of that work just to make it easier for people so that you can just you can hand pick ingredients from those recipes and make up what you like, and they will work for you.
And I will say to everybody that last month we published, or this month, was it last month? We published, Mark wrote it and we produced it, Biostimulants in Agriculture, which is a very comprehensive article and includes a lot of his recipes in there. I'm not sure if all of them are in there, are they, Mark?
They're changing. They're evolving all the time, Kate. But yeah, the bulk of them will definitely be in there. And I think there's a bit on our optimizing plant nutrition article as well. Hey,
yeah.
Yep.
So for those of you who perhaps are not a member of the online community Talking After Hours, it's free. So I'd really encourage you to join, and then you can access all that material very, very simply. But I will also be sending out Mark's presentation with his recording of the webinar, so there'll be the recipes that you get today. So many thanks, Mark, for your time.
Thank you, Kate, for having me.
Sharing your expertise as well. And as I promised, I'll be emailing out a recording of the webinar, and I will also post it in the Knowledge Bank on Talking After Hours. And Mark, I might just get you to mute yourself because I can hear myself through the computer. That's better. As I said, if you're not a member, I'd really encourage you to join and just head to our website and find the tab Talking After Hours. And our next activity, Mark, I think we haven't got any webinars planned for a little while, but we have got a workshop coming up. Mark's going to go, what? We've got a workshop coming up in June on making your own Johnson Sioux compost. So that's the next time you'll get to see Mark, and hopefully most of you can make it to that. But otherwise, that's it from me. So thanks once again, Mark, and thanks to Soilwise for their support, and to you, the audience, for tuning in. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks a lot.